For those of you I've not yet met, I'm Susan Murray, Director of the David Hume Institute, and I am delighted to welcome you here to this briefing on the latest Understanding Scotland Economy Tracker. The tracker is a quarterly survey that we undertake to ensure the everyday lives of people behind the economic headlines stay front of our minds. The results you will hear today were collected in the first week of May. So we've turned this round at breakneck speed to make sure that you've got the data you need in all your roles and can use it as people are telling you what they think rather than getting it in 6 months' time or a year's time when it'll be out of date because the world is changing so fast at the moment. I'd like to thank Brodie's for hosting us here today in this beautiful location. For those of you watching this online, I'm sorry you don't see the view. It is fantastic and the sun has come out to welcome us. Before the main discussion gets underway, and to keep you all safe, I'd just like to confirm there are no fire alarms planned. So if the fire alarm does go off, please do head to the nearest exit. And the event is being recorded, so the speakers have microphones, but they do not work for amplification in the room. So if you can't hear at the back, please do feel free to move further forward. We've got seats right up in the front row, as well as a couple around the sides. And so all that's left for me to do now is introduce the speakers. Oh, and one thing, if anyone's hard of hearing, please do move nearer the front. Scott Edgar, many of you that have been to these events before will know, is research manager at the Bisley Partnership. He will present the Understanding Scotland Economy Tracker findings and then show you lots of lovely graphs, lots of exciting data. All about the economic confidence and binding tensions over time that helps us track and monitor economic attitudes and public opinion. Scott will be followed by Mary Spowage. Mary is director of the Fraser of Allender Institute, and she leads the Institute's work with various partners, including those in business, the public, and third sectors. Mary's on the leadership team for the Centre for Inclusive Trade Policy and the Economics Statistics Centre of Excellence. Gosh, this is a mouthful. Previously, she was Deputy Chief Executive of the Scottish Fiscal Commission and Head of National Accounts at the Scottish Government. She has over 15 years' experience working in different areas of statistics analysis, including transport, household survey, and performance measurement. And Mary will be followed by Emma Jackson. Emma is Head of Social Justice at Citizens Advice Scotland, having previously worked for a debt charity called Christians Against Poverty as Scotland Director. She's a regular broadcaster and contributor to BBC Radio Scotland's Thought for the Day. And she's also a board member of Poverty Alliance, convener of Public Life and Social Justice for the Church of Scotland, and lives in the rural borders with her family and pets. Then, after we've heard reflection from Marion Spowage, we will come to you, the audience, for questions and reflections. So without further ado, over to Scott.
Good morning, everyone. Let me drop my pen to start. So, as Susan mentioned, we collected the data for this in the first week of May. So, just a wee bit more about Understanding Scotland and the Understanding Scotland Economy Tracker. We've now been running this for 15 waves, so nearly 4 years now we've been running this study. And what that gives us basically is a lot of data, a lot of ability to track different attitudes across different things. So as many of you are familiar with this piece of work will be aware of, we have, kind of now long-term findings on people's economic confidence. We have sort of long-run findings now on the issues that matter to people in Scotland, and also how people are responding to the cost of living crisis or concerns over money matters in general. The survey was run from the 1st to the 6th of May this year, earlier this month. Important to note that was the weekend immediately after the local election results in England, and that's maybe a wee bit of a kind of trail for some of what you might see in here. The results come from a sample of 2,326 responses gathered during that time. So we always open with this chart here, which looks at how people in Scotland are feeling, and it's a deliberately, kind of broad question that asks people whether they think things in Scotland are going in the right or the wrong direction. And what we've seen for quite a long time now is that a majority of people in Scotland have felt that things are going in the wrong direction, and actually that's increased this wave. So we had our peak back in May 24 at 62%. That was the highest proportion that we've seen saying that things were going in the wrong direction in Scotland. And for the 3 waves that followed that, there was a slow, sort of small drop in that figure. However, that's gone up 6 percentage points this wave to 59%. So we get 6 in 10 people in Scotland telling us that they feel that things are going in the wrong direction. And I think, as broad as that is as a kind of terms of concept, I think it's worth reflecting on that just for a moment. We've got 6 in 10 people telling us that they think things aren't good, things are going the wrong way. And what does that sort of mean for people overall? And other bits of work that we've done, we often we hear people talk about how they're kind of fed up with things as they are. They feel like things aren't improving. They feel like they're not listened to, or that nothing's actually going to change. We kind of hear people often say people are scunnered. I think we're sort of at the point now where people are a bit like, so what? So that's what we sort of hear from where we are now. The kind of, yes, we understand that you're not happy with the economic situation. We understand that you keep having to make these choices. We know we hear you. I think people are now kind of past that, wanting to be, that's they've kind of been listened to. They want to now see what's going to happen. And I think that's a challenge for our kind of leaders going into the Scottish Parliament election next year, how they can make a case that they can turn that into making Scotland maybe feel a bit more like it's going in the right direction and create an environment that's a wee bit more um, inspirational for people. And then when we look at the issues, so as I said, we've been doing this now for nearly 4 years, which is incredible to think about. But it means that we've got really long-term data on the issues that matter to people. And what we consistently see time and time again is that healthcare and the NHS and the cost of living and inflation are the top two issues. So what we get people to do here is select three issues from a really, really long list. And at the last presentation, I got interrupted at this point because some things are not on there. So I'm actually created a little slide next with some of the things I often get asked about and where they are. But basically, it's only on here if it's above 10%. So what we see here is we have these two issues that are pulling away, and for the whole time series basically have been the two key issues. Actually, the cost of living and inflation was in a really long, like term, like kind of downward trend in terms of how people are prioritising it until this wave where there's been a small uptick of 2 percentage points. But what we see is these two issues consistently stay there, and they're across the board. And I'll show in a minute how these are the top two issues basically across almost every demographic, which is quite interesting in itself. And then we have this big sort of range of issues sort of above 10%, but not quite at 20%, sort of between 10 and 17. And I know it's really hard to see that on this graph here, but if we take them in order, we have housing at 12%, crime and criminal justice at 13, education and schools at 14, trust in politics at 15%, the economy at 16%, and that's actually gone down 5 percentage points since the last wave. And then we have immigration as the fourth biggest issue for people in Scotland at the minute at plus two from the last wave, and poverty and inequality at 17%. And what we kind of see here is that those top two issues are consistent, but in here there's a lot of movement between those issues that are sort of between that sort of 10 and 20%. And I think the big interesting thing as we kind of think about what's going to happen over the next year is, can any of those issues be the issue that breaks out and become a defining issue in the Scottish Parliament election? But also, how are some of these issues actually linked to some of the other issues that we see here? So, for example, with healthcare and the NHS, is there an opportunity for people to be talking about how housing impacts health outcomes, how education can impact on it, how social care could help perhaps ease some of the pressure on the NHS? There's opportunities to make those linkages for issues that people really, really care about. Um, and I'm going to talk more about that immigration figure, by the way, because I know it kind of jumps out. But as I said, I also get interrupted and asked what about, because I'm not on that graph at that 10%. So what I've done here is I've taken some of those issues and I've put them on a chart here. So this is a proportion of people who, mention certain issues. So 10% will put social care in their top three, 10% mental health and well-being, only 9% for the environment and climate change. So that's the last couple of waves now where it's not been on above 10% in terms of people's priorities. The highest we ever seen that was in the first wave of this, but that was around the time of COP26. And actually this 9% is quite low. It tends to be around 15. So actually it's kind of tail off in the last year is quite interesting, and perhaps a sign of the kind of discourse that we have in our politics at the moment. 6% in aging population, I put that in just because we've seen kind of various things and debates around what impact, our kind of declining working age population is going to have in the long run. Doesn't feel like that's cutting through to people, and people aren't really picking that up as something that they're concerned about. And then the constitution and devolution down at 7%, and transport at 3%. I will say it's quite a long list, and I'm more than happy to share the full list of all the issues that we put on it, but this gives a sense of where some things that we think might be higher up the list, if we just sort of think about different issues, where they actually are. And then, as I mentioned, across the demographics, what we see here is that healthcare and NHS is pretty consistent across groups. So what we've done here is we just take 16 to 34 and 65 plus, so the youngest in the sample and the oldest in the sample, and then males and females. So we see that for all of those, healthcare and NHS and cost of living and inflation are in their top two issues. Um, when we look at 16 to 34s, they're more likely to think poverty and inequality is a top issue in Scotland. Trust in politics is actually quite consistent across age groups, which is interesting. And as we see, immigration's in at 15% amongst those aged 65 plus, but doesn't feature in the top five for those aged 16 to 34. Um, and then male and female, we see again, there are slight differences there with the healthcare and cost of living being the kind of top issues. What's interesting though is we see that the sort of male response are kind of spread across more of the issues than female respondents overall, but that's kind of concealed in those figures there at the top. And I mentioned that I would just kind of look at this uh, trend on the immigration figures. The reason why why I kind of want to pull this out was it's not like a big bang in this wave. It's not just went up sort of +6 in this wave, but it's been a long-term sort of gradual increase we've seen in the proportion of people talking about immigration as one of the top issues facing Scotland. So back when we first did this in 2021, 5% named it amongst their top three issues, and it kind of stayed between that 5 to 10% until May 24 last year, where it went 10%. It went up to 10% of people, and it's increased by 6 percentage points over that last year. So over the last year, there's been this sort of gradual build of it in terms of its salience as an issue. Um, you know, that's also 12 percentage points higher than it was 2 years ago, for example. So it's clearly the kind of discussions around immigration and the things that are happening in our politics are clearly impacting people. What's interesting, or what I suppose we don't know, is was this always something that was sort of salient, was there, and then actually it's become more salient with time and with the fact it's been discussed more, so people feel more able to say it, or is it actually that the debate's happening, people are more engaged with it, and I suppose that's the interesting thing to try and unpick. And it's there's some demographic differences in this. So those aged 16 to 34, 13% have it in their top three issues. 22% of those aged 55 to 64 have it in their top issues. And what's interesting about that, when we're thinking in the kind of the politics of it, is that if you look at opinion polls, that's the group that's probably most likely to support reform, aged 55 to 64 in most opinion polls that we see. Those in SIMD1 are more likely to put immigration amongst their top three issues at 22%, compared to those in SIMD5 in the least deprived areas at 14%. And we also ask people, and we move on then to ask people about their economic priorities. And once again, cost of living and inflation outstrips all the other priorities that we ask about. That's the biggest economic priority that people have. And that's been consistent through this series. It's been up there for a very long time as the top issue, about 6 and 10, naming that, followed by living standards and wages, lack of spending on public services, poverty and inequality, and managing public finances, tax and spending. And there's some interesting demographic differences in that too. Younger participants are more likely to see living standards and wages as a priority. You know, um, Male participants are more likely to name things like economic growth and trade than female participants, and female participants are more likely to name things like poverty and inequality than our male participants in this study are. But as we can see, the cost of living, people aren't finished with the cost of living crisis in their minds. It's still in people's minds, day to day across both kind of more general issues and economic issues. And it's kind of no surprise that it's on people's mind, because people are still feeling quite glum when it comes to the economic outlook. I always hope that one day I'll come here and say, everyone's feeling great, everyone's feeling happy, but it's yet to happen to me. But maybe one day. So we've got 7 in 10 people think that over the last year that the general economic conditions have worsened. So that's up here in this chart here. You'll notice that the much betters don't have a bar on it. So read into that what you will. And also 7 in 10 think that things are going to be worse again in a year's time. So people are kind of in this cycle when they're thinking about, being really pessimistic when they're thinking about the general economy. Now, obviously, could we kind of see at a macro level that, some indicators are stabilising. But I think the interesting thing here is this is how people's perception of the economy feels. They feel like things have got worse, and they think it's going to get worse again. And as always, when we look at personal finances, there's a bit of a gap there between how negative people are in a general sense and how negative they are about their own personal finances. But still, about 1 in 2 think that they're worse off than they were this time last year. And 44%, so just above 4 in 10, think they're going to be worse off again in a year's time. So again, we get a sense here that people are just really not feeling very optimistic about the economy at all. Um, and one way that we sort of show this is in this net graph here, where we basically take those who say it's going to get better and take away those that say it's going to get worse. I have to do my health warning every time with this graph that this axis starts at 0, so it's negative the whole way down. So that's like a minus net score the whole way down. And what we see here is what I was explaining there, where you have the two general the lines for the general economic conditions are down there. So we've got basically people net negative on both their past perception and what they think is going to happen in the next 12 months. And then similarly, also negative when they look at their uh, personal circumstances. But what is kind of striking now is that we sort of had an upward trajectory. It wasn't exactly, people weren't exactly buzzing about the economy, for want of a better term than that. But they were getting better for quite a long time coming out of COVID. It did feel like people were getting slightly more optimistic, if you can call minus 70% net more optimistic. But literally, we were at the floor coming out of the pandemic in November 22. That's like a minus 90% something net score, which is quite something when you try to dwell on that for like a moment. But it's turned again, and now people are beginning to feel less optimistic once again. And it's interesting to kind of think about that, and what can sort of be done about that. Basically, it's not felt equally. So we look here at people who think that their own finances have got worse in the last year than or they've got worse off in the last year in their personal finances than they were a year ago. So if we look here, women are slightly more likely to say that, they think their personal financial situation is worse now. Those in C2DE, in terms of like social class split, they are more likely to think that they've got worse off in the last year. And similarly, those in SIMD 1 and 2, the most deprived postcodes, are more likely to think that they've got worse off in the last year. So again, as we always find with this, these things aren't felt evenly across the piece, but we've still got high proportions across almost every break who feel like they've got worse off over the last year. And then, but all this has an impact, right? So it's not, we can talk about it kind of like, how people feel and people's outlook. But sorry, I actually lost my voice last week, but it's fine. So we've got so what we see here is what people report that they've done as a result of concerns with money matters. And these things have an impact on not just on people's sort of overall well-being, they have an impact on their health, they have an impact on their ability to work, right? So we're saying half of people are cutting back on sort of what we might call discretionary spending, so on non-essential spending and leisure activities. I mean, that's quite sad, right? And that's more likely, especially cutting back on leisure activities with households with children than it is households that don't have children. A lot of people still cutting back on energy use. There's a bit of seasonality in that, though, so we tend to see that figure will dip over the next couple of months and then come back up again in the when we come back to the winter. But also in the middle here, we've got this sort of impact on mental health, losing sleep and buying less fresh produce. So we've got 1 in 4 are telling us they've lost sleep in the last year over their personal finances. Now that's down 3 percentage points on the last wave, but it's still a lot of people reporting that. People feeling less effective at work, and strained relationships at home as well is also quite an interesting one in terms of people's experience. And again, not felt evenly. So if we kind of look at this chart here, what we're showing is basically the kind of difference in these proportions between, on the left-hand side with the yellow bars, those aged 16 to 34 and 65 plus, and the green C2D and ABC1, and then the orange households with children and households without children, or households that don't have children in them rather. And basically what we see here is that, younger people report a much larger toll on their mental health as a result of money matters than the kind of oldest participants in the sample. And are also more likely to report doing things like borrowing from friends. Actually, across all of these behaviours, you can see there's a net positive for the youngest participants. The one I often point out in this is the households with children versus the households without, and that's strained relationships at home. So we're seeing that parents are really feeling the pressure as a result of money matters, or people with children in their home now. 19% percentage point difference between those with children and those without in their household, showing that there's a real impact that money matters is having on those relationships within the home, and that cutting back on leisure activities at kind of a 12 percentage point difference. And that's interesting to think about, kind of children not being able to participate in leisure activities as a result of money matters, and what the long-term impact on that can be for sort of health and well-being and things like that. And then we also explored financial fragility. So what we look at here is we ask people, how confident are you that you could pay for an emergency expense of £100 without having to borrow? and an emergency expense of £500 without having to borrow. And what we see here is that, 1 in 5 tellers are not confident that they could, shoulder an emergency expense of £100 without having to borrow, which is quite a striking figure. It's slightly down on the last time that we ran it, but only slightly. So we're at 1 in 5 people saying that. Actually rises to above 4 in 10 when we look at an emergency expense of £500. So we have 44% of people telling us if they had an emergency expense of £500, they would have to borrow to cover it, which is quite scary, really, when you think about it. It shows that a lot of people are operating with very, very limited resources out there, and any kind of shock would lead them to have to borrow. And again, that again that is different for different demographics. So if we look at the figure on the households with children, they are far more likely to say that they wouldn't be able to shoulder an emergency expense of £500 than households without children. And then we look at another couple of indicators as well. So on here we're showing basically, I don't my pen again. We are showing how confident people are that they could get another job within 3 months if necessary. So what we're seeing here is that 48% are saying that they're confident they could get a new job within 3 months if necessary if they had to, but more than half are saying they're not confident that they could get another job within 3 months if they had to. And then when we look about financial circumstances and being able to pay for an increase in housing costs, what we find here is around a third of people are not confident that they could shoulder an increase in their housing costs if it increased in the next 6 months. So that kind of fragility piece is there. There's a kind of slightly less confidence in the labour market than last time we asked in terms of being able to go find something, but there's still that fragility around being able to shoulder emergency expenses or expenses that you might not be able to control, like your housing costs being increased as a result of whatever. And again, this just shows a sort of trend here. So what we can see is the on the white line on the bottom, that's just a net of confident and not confident. Fortunately, this axis isn't all minus, it's mostly positive. So we're not starting quite at the floor as well on the economic outlook. But what we see here is there's been a slight dip in the proportion of people who are confident they could get another job if needed to, and slight increases, but not particularly higher net levels of being able to pay for. So most people think they can pay an emergency expense of £100, but we can see here that these are all kind of, then that's increased a bit, but that £500 one hasn't increased by as much, and neither has the housing costs. And then we kind of rounded off the survey this time by asking people about a series of measures of how they felt about managing societal risk. So it's probably not a surprise that 95% of people agree that people are less effective at work if they're not eating or sleeping well. But also there's quite a high proportion of people who feel that employers have a duty to, pay wages that meet people's basic needs. So that's about 9 in 10. And that's higher amongst women than men, and higher amongst those aged 16 to 34. They're more likely to agree that employers have that duty than the men or those aged 65 plus. 8 in 10 agree that it costs the public purse more in the long run to deal with the consequences of not being able to meet their basic needs now. It's an interesting to dwell on because we often see quick fixes and sticking plasters for certain issues, and it appears that people kind of understand that idea that it probably costs more in the long term to be doing that and take perhaps more bold approaches. But then the test of that's always when bold approaches are actually proposed to people, how they react to them. But that's a matter for another day. And then 7 in 10 agree that there's a collective responsibility to ensure a safety net for those struggling during hard economic times. That's actually down quite a bit on last time we done it. Went down by about 8 percentage points. Those two figures there in terms of agreeing with that, which is interesting as well. And then we ask people if they pay more tax to ensure there's an effective social security safety net. And I do have to flag this because it's a little bit, the graph's a bit hard to read because of rounding. So it says 14 plus 24 there, which adds up to 38. That actually adds up to 39% when it's rounded. So 39% agree with it. And then the other one, which is 16 and 23, looks like it adds up to 39, but it actually adds up to 38. But it's roughly equal as the sort of headline in terms of the agree, disagree. So despite the fact if you add those up in your head, it looks like the disagree is higher. It's not, it's just rounding, which was really bugging me when we were checking the report at the end, because I was like, something has to be wrong somewhere, but it's not. So yeah, we can see the other people are kind of split on that in terms of that willingness to pay more tax themselves in order to ensure there's an effective social security safety net. So with that, that's the kind of run through from the report this time. As ever, there's plenty more in the report, and as ever, if there's anything that you would like us to look at in more detail, we've got plenty of breaks and all of that, and we're more than happy to hear from you. But thank you very much. Sorry, I'll put it back to the graph. Any graph? Yeah. There we go.
Thanks, and thanks for inviting me along to give some thoughts today. I'm always struck when I look at the results of this survey, which provides really valuable insights into how people are feeling in Scotland, that many of the priorities that people are outlining are very linked to each other. You know, the issues around cost of living has become kind of totemic for the way people are feeling about their living standards, or maybe the general economy more broadly. So there's lots of interesting research, I suppose, into what people are really thinking about when they say the cost of living or inflation. And I don't think it's surprising that the general feeling about economic conditions tracks essentially where the inflation rate is. And now that we're seeing an uptick in prices, unfortunately, in the most recent data, people are starting to feel a bit more worried about it, particularly because they can see it coming through in their energy bills and so on. On the other side of that, you know, generally, if you look at the headline economic indicators, you would think that things are a bit better than maybe some people are feeling. We have seen inflation come down considerably. The labour market, relatively speaking, is strong, although there are lots of issues with how we're measuring the labour market at the moment, and we certainly don't understand the reasons or nature of inactivity enough. But we saw, you know, really strong, quite strong growth in the UK economy for the first quarter, for example. I guess, you know, many of us would be worried perhaps that that's a bit of stockpiling or sugar rush before expected price increases that people are expecting due to tariffs, and also just generally price increases coming through in the economy because of things like the employer national insurance contributions rise, which, you know, has led many forecasters to say that inflation will probably go up to near 4% at the end of this year. So you can see in business confidence surveys that we do as well that there's a lot of gloom still out there, despite these sort of some of these macro indicators looking good. And it does remind me a little bit of this conversation about the US economy when that election was going on, that, you know, all of the objective indicators seem to suggest that the economy was absolutely, you know, flying, but people weren't feeling it, and they weren't feeling it in their own pockets. So they punished, you know, the incumbent despite what the economic data was telling them. There's so much happening, as Susan mentioned, and things are moving so fast with various, you know, trade deals being announced, and potentially quite serious impacts for employers in different parts of the country. You know, with the president of the US sort of turning on a dime and changing things. So it's all very uncertain, I guess. And that's really coming through, particularly in business investment intentions, for example. Folks are kind of waiting a wee bit to see what's going to happen to decide whether to invest. And particularly those companies who are quite impacted by tariffs, you know, our food and drink manufacturers, for example, are feeling that uncertainty come through, albeit that can be offset somewhat by, for example, the UK-EU trade deal that we've seen recently. I was really struck by the immigration graph. It may be about the discourse. It may be about it being talked about more. It may also be about the fact that immigration has been very high. You know, it's historically very high right now. And that is to Scotland as well as to the UK. Although we in Scotland don't tend to get our sort of population share of the migrants coming to the UK. They're more concentrated in London and the southeast. We have seen very high levels of migration. So again, it's interesting to know what people have in their mind. Is it answering that it's a negative thing? Is it linked to the ageing population and the desire for more migration? You know, it's hard to know. I would suspect, given the demographics of that it is being seen as a, you know, migration is perhaps too high, but it has been very high, and we do need to remember that context when we're thinking about how people are answering these questions. I think your last chart, where people were sort of acknowledging that a social security safety net is very important, that it's worth spending money now to avoid expenditure in the future and more expenditure to get better outcomes. But I'm not sure if I want to pay more tax for that, is a key challenge to parties in the run-up to the election next year. We're expecting a public service reform plan from the Scottish Government in June, I think. And many of the issues politicians really haven't been willing to speak about because they are long-term. We do have to have a conversation about the sustainability of the size of the public sector in Scotland and the level of pay in the public sector, for example, because half of the money we spend in Scotland on public services goes on pay. And we've already seen a number of pay deals announced that completely go beyond the pay policy that was set out by the Scottish Government in December in their budget. So there is a fiscal sustainability challenge which is crystallising more urgently now than it has in the past. So it would be good to see politicians discuss that in the run-up to the Holyrood election. Whether they will, I'm more cynical.
Brilliant. I think the question I'm always asking myself when I look at the Understanding Scotland data is how does that align then with what we see from the 59 cabs that are in every corner of Scotland providing advice to around about 200,000 people each year. And the fact that you're consistently seeing the cost of living come out as the top concern absolutely aligns with what our advisors are seeing from people. Affording the everyday essentials that we all need is right up there for people. And I would say it's not just on people's minds, but it is the lived reality of people. I think one of the brilliant things about this tracker is the immediacy of which you've been able to get us this data from the very beginning of May. You might remember from the media, we had April dubbed as awful April, as we saw increases across most of our bills, so things like council tax, telecoms, utilities. And so for the vast majority of households, the lived reality is for people is that the things that we all need to live our day-to-day life have got really expensive. I think energy is something that we absolutely can't ignore. And yes, last week we did see a bit of a come down in the energy price cap, but that's of a backdrop of wildly increased prices since pre-pandemic times. The average level of energy debt for someone coming There we go. That's all right. It wasn't me. That's my big fear in life, is somehow I'm breaking technology or doing something not right. I was going to say the average level of energy debt for someone coming to a local cab is about £2,500. That absolutely skyrockets to £3,000 for those in remote and rural communities. And I think that's an important group of folks to think about when we're looking at some of the demographics, is how's this all of the experience for those in remote and rural parts of Scotland? From our point of view, it's much worse, unfortunately. I think another area where we kind of feel really aligned with what your tracker is saying is the fact that financial stress is really affecting people's day-to-day lives. We know that deeply. People will be telling our local advisors that money worries are not just robbing people of sleep, but in fact all-consuming. It's the first thing someone's thinking about when they get up, and sadly it's the last thing folks are thinking about when they go to bed. We know that it has a really direct impact on people's physical and mental well-being as people are just trying to navigate and juggle the everyday challenges of life. And I think one of the things that we need to be really mindful of is that those who are finding life most tricky at the moment, those households on the lowest incomes, are actually a dynamic cohort of people. We see people moving in and out of sort of really kind of being able to struggle. It's not a static group of people who have low incomes, and actually a phrase time and time again our advisors hear from people is folks saying, I never thought this was going to happen to me. I didn't think I would experience anything like that. And so it's really important to remember that absolutely every single one of us could experience an income shock. None of us are immune to things like relationship breakdown, redundancy, a health shock like cancer that suddenly tips the manageable into the unmanageable. And I think that's really important, that we don't stereotype and sort of lean into the myths and misconceptions of who it is and why it is people are finding life tricky. It really can happen to any of us. I think as well, when we think about the groups who are experiencing kind of most harm at the moment, and then sort of look at some of the demographic data about who's concerned about what from your results, again, I think we see quite a lot of alignment. We know that women experience the worst of poverty, and that women have been really shouldering the burden of the cost of living crisis. Our data would show as well that single adult non-pensioner households are finding life really tough at the moment. And I think some of the why about that is that that's a group of people for whom policy interventions are not reaching right now. So if you've got a family, maybe you're benefiting from Scottish Child Payment. If you're older, maybe something like pension credit or winter fuel payment is kind of reaching for you. But if you're, say, 52 and kind of living by yourself, you're not kind of falling into the lanes that these policies are going to be able to help you with. And again, another real group that we have real concern about at the moment is those living with disability and ill health. Over 2/3 of people who seek advice from a local cab have a disability or long-term health condition. And we know those folks are coming to seek advice across multiple areas, so housing, social security, energy. And people are facing really difficult stuff as they are being forced to do things like skip meals, not reduce or ration energy use, not be able to charge essential devices. And I think finally, the last bit of reflections I have is on the statistic that sort of 60% of folk in Scotland think that we're going in the wrong direction, that sense really of that something's broken. And I think it does speak to the sense of disillusionment and almost maybe a bit of despair that people are continuing to feel at the moment. I think probably a sentiment that might sit amongst that is that we want to see an economy that works for all of us, but I guess we're perhaps not agreed on what exactly that looks like and what are the suite of interventions that we need for that economy to work. I take encouragement from the fact that we've got almost about 70% of people that say we need a social safety net to be able to catch us. When I described, those times that could kind of happen to any of us, I do think that that is encouraging. But I'm probably concerned to see that we're seeing that kind of dip at the moment, and that level of decline that we're seeing. And I guess I'm just reflecting on, I wonder what that speaks to at the moment. I wonder what's happening in the media, in public discourse. I wonder what framing it is for people that's making that kind of drop down. And I guess that's a real challenge to people like myself who work in social justice, those of us from the third sector, and a challenge really for us to think about what's the story that we need to tell? Because I think we need to tell a better story of why a social safety net, why improved wages and increased public services are good for all of us and good for all of our economy. And so I really think we need to think quite carefully about how we present some of the solutions that we need to see about what an economy could look like that works for all of us. I've got some ideas, but I've spoken for too long. So ask me some questions and I'll tell you some of those solutions.
Thanks, everyone. I'm aware we've spoken a bit longer from the panelists than we usually do, so I'm not going to come in with any questions now. I'm going to turn it straight over to the audience, and I can see a hand up already, so I will move the microphone round to you.
Thanks very much. Can I explore the immigration question and the interpretation that you give to concern, given the comments earlier? I mean, if I were asked whether immigration is a concern for me, I would say yes. But the reason that I would say yes is because I'm worried that Scotland won't get sufficient labour force, that I'm worried about the staffing of the NHS and social care, and I'm worried about the UK government's policy on overseas students coming to Scotland, given the dependency of our university sector on students from overseas. So I'm concerned, and it's a high level of concern in general terms, but it's not because I'm about to go out and vote reform to keep the small boats at bay. So, I mean, my question really is: can you interpret? Is your data sufficient to be able to interpret the motivation of the answer to the question on immigration, or is there anything further that could be done in future surveys to try and assess whether the concern is a positive concern or a negative concern, if I can put it that way?
That's a really good question. So the question obviously just says immigration, right? So you're quite right. You could select that and say, yeah, because I'm concerned for these reasons, therefore I'm going to select it amongst my top three. I think when we look at the kind of demographics that underlie it, we kind of have reason to believe that it's probably mostly not that. Just in terms of our experience doing other bits of work in sort of focus group settings and things like that as well. That it's probably not a big cohort of people in that sort of positive. But I do take the point because obviously the debate has actually moved on since we did this survey, right? So actually, Keir Starmer hadn't done his announcement yet when this survey ran. People like yourself are probably more likely then now to be going, well, actually, I'm concerned about immigration now. It's in my issues because the mood music from the Prime Minister is actually, I see it as negative towards our future prosperity and our future outcomes. I kind of pointed out the timing about it being immediately after the local election result down in England, primarily because I think that's quite interesting in terms of us seeing that we've seen a slow burn increase in immigration as an issue. In terms of the second part of your question, there's probably something we can explore more in, like, a future survey, so we can ask about those attitudes to migration in a way that actually directly addresses that, and then you would then be able to sort of cross tab the immigration concern against people's answers and attitudes towards that. Unfortunately, in this survey, we just don't have that that answer right now, but we would be able to probably make a good guess that it's mostly, for the most part, maybe people who are concerned about it for the kind of reasons that are not the reasons that you outlined.
Thank you. Hi there, my name's Finley. I work for a children's charity called Magic Breakfast, and I suppose my question is probably for Emma. With poverty only at 17% and the First Minister saying that the driving force of his government is eradicating child poverty, what does that say to organisations like ours in the anti-poverty space, especially moving toward the next election?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think the two things are aligned in terms of cost of living being that primary concern for people, and then poverty and the inequality being not too far away, because those two things are inextricably linked. There are so many of us that are still really struggling with the cost of everyday essentials, and that. Particularly one of the things we would see across our cab network, and no doubt where you work as well, is just that consumes everything for people. Like, it's really hard to think about other things when you don't know if you can afford the shopping this week and you can't turn the heating on. And so to be able to kind of pull your lens up and think about those wider things. I think I would continue to reflect on this idea of how do we tell a better story about the benefits of tackling poverty and inequality for all of us? I think that is something we really need to grapple with so that we can find a narrative that cuts through, that is going to speak something, I guess, to the sense of disillusionment and despair that people are thinking, so that irrespective, I guess, of the size of your income, you will know that tackling poverty and inequality is good for all of us. First and foremost, it is good for those people who are trapped in awful situations, but it benefits all of us. It will benefit our NHS, our education system, it will benefit business and our economy more widely. And that's the thing I think we need to wrestle with is what's our language, what's our framing, what is the better story that we can tell?
I think as well, if I can add to that, there is perhaps something about how people feel about their individual circumstances and whether when they say about poverty and inequality, are they talking about their own difficulties or are they talking about societal difficulties that they observe? So is somebody who is in poverty and in crisis likely to say that they're worried about the cost of living and inflation? I would say probably more than they would say about poverty and inequality. And it'd be interesting to know actually if the people who are saying poverty and inequality is an issue aren't people who are in poverty. So it might be a bit about stigmatization and the way that you view your own circumstances as well. People are wanting to say, I'm struggling, but they might not want to think about themselves as being in poverty, perhaps, as well.
Right to the back again. Just standing in the wrong place.
Hi, I'm Martin. I'm from the Scottish Government. I'm also a trustee of Citizens Advice and Rights Fife, which I think is the largest bureau in the CAB network in Scotland. I'd one for the panel and then one for Emma. So firstly for the panel, are you surprised to see housing so low on that chart behind you, and that in fact is also on a downward trend? And then for Emma, do you think housing sits differently amongst the kind of demographic of people that the cabs deal with than it maybe does in that chart there?
I wouldn't say I'm surprised. It's sort of been around that figure for quite a long time, and there's occasionally it will jump up. So about last year, it was a little bit higher. Around the time the housing emergency was declared, it was a little bit higher than it is now, but it stayed in that sort of band. And I feel like with these sort of figures that are in that band there, it's like I say we talk about housing, and housing touches lots of different aspects of life, right? Like it touches health, it touches it touches a sense of community, it touches all sorts of education, it touches all sorts of different things. I think one of the things that I've kind of been saying constantly is, well, is one of these issues going to break out? Is it actually going to be the issue that defines like the next election next year? So parties, everyone's saying there's a housing emergency, but who's going to present the sort of the strategy then that people then grasp onto and go, actually, I can see there's going to be a difference in housing, and then you might see that come up. All these issues are also like close together that I think it kind of points to that wider sense of disillusionment. It's almost like people are like, well, here's all these things that I think aren't working, and I have to pick sort of one of them. And so I'm not surprised because it's been at that figure for a long time, but I do think there's probably it feels like it's talked about a lot more than that suggests in the chart.
Yeah, I would also think that a lot of people who are struggling with housing costs, particularly renters at the moment, are going to wrap it up in cost of living as well. I mean, I really do think that that's quite likely to be where a lot of their concerns are manifesting themselves rather than picking housing, perhaps. And we saw in the other chart about people being able to cope with an increase in their housing costs. I think a lot of people are concerned about the wider environment particularly in the rental sector at the moment, that if something happens, they're okay right now, but they know if they have to move, then they might not be able to afford the rent in the new place that they're going to. So there's a lot of concerns like that around. But, if you're talking to policymakers, particularly in local government, housing is the first thing they're talking about right now. The crisis that they're having to deal with and manage, and particularly in the urban areas, but not just in urban areas. Rurality has a lot of difficulty with supply as well. Is really stark at the moment. So it's the first thing that they're saying and they're talking about, because they see and recognise the fact that the lack of supply of housing in the right place at the right price is really holding back their economies as well.
I think it was last week that marked a year since the Scottish Government declared a housing emergency. So it's a huge issue that really isn't going anywhere. In terms of the sorts of advice that the cab network provide, predominantly it is for those in the private rented sector who are seeking advice from a local bureau. And then consistently over the last 12 months that there's been a housing emergency, we've seen a rise in demand for advice on homelessness and threatened homelessness. So people kind of sitting right there on a knife edge with being able to afford where it is that they're staying. Interestingly as well, we're seeing that rise in issue with the affordability of rents, not just in the private rented sector, but also within the social rented sector, which I think is a real alarm bell. If that people cannot afford to pay the cheapest rents that we have in society, what is that pointing to in terms of some of the wider structural issues about insufficient income that many folks are grappling with? I think it's going to be an enduring concern for us as we go on this year, because we've just recently seen the end of the temporary rent freeze was there as a sort of emergency measures as part of the cost of living package. And we're already seeing people coming and talking to their local cabs where their rents have gone up 40, 50, 80%. And people cannot absorb that level of increase.
Hi, I'm Katrina Matheson from Lincoln Public Affairs, and I'm also a DHI trustee. I'm quite interested in the healthcare and NHS figure that you've got, Scott, and I know we've touched on this already about how respondents answer these questions and whether it's what they perceive to be an issue or what is actually affecting them. And obviously we know that some people rely on the NHS more than others. As we go into sort of the campaign for the election in Scotland next year, do you think that might go up as we see, the NHS perhaps on the, making headlines more often as opposition parties use it?
I think what's interesting is it's maintained its place quite highly there in terms of usually about half of people, selecting it as one of the top 3 issues, and we see that cut across the demographics. So I think that suggests that even people who are not interacting with the NHS on a kind of frequent basis still see the NHS as one of the top issues. And I do think it's a lot around, there's a lot of discussion around the NHS sort of all the time. Parties are always keen to talk about how they'll improve the NHS. There's known issues with, kind of waiting lists. There's a perception out there that, the 8 a.m. rush. We hear all these ways of talking about the NHS constantly in our politics. So it's certainly a core issue for people. I think what we kind of hear when we do qualitative work is people have a kind of feeling that it used to work a bit better than it does now, and therefore that perception definitely exists. People definitely feel like it's not working as well. It does respond to seasonality sometimes, so it'll tend to go up a little bit in the winter. So when we kind of have got quite used to seeing these, unfortunately, these sort of emergencies where there's like ambulances not able to get in the winter and things like that. It goes a wee bit higher then, but it really does maintain up there. So I think it's kind of across the board. I think it's a lot to do with the discourse and how important it is in people's discussion, but there is definitely a really deep perception that the NHS isn't working for people, and that's why it maintains so high.
Hi there. Is this working all right? Yeah. um, I think that's an interesting point. I think what sometimes we miss is that healthcare is actually not just about the NHS. It's not just centred in institutions, and particularly what I'm talking about is about social care and care at home, care in the community, preventative care, primary care. I work for a charity who supports anyone looking after someone. We classify those as unpaid carers, and the stats are really quite striking in terms of people leaving the workforce. 600 people a day leave the workforce across the UK because they have a caring responsibility for somebody. The social care that perhaps would have been there pre-pandemic or even middle of pandemic is not there anymore. That's affected by immigration and recent rules on people coming into work in the country in that care in the sector. And we know that unpaid carers are often described as being economically inactive. I think, Emma, you mentioned there something about not understanding inactivity. There are lots of reasons for inactivity, but I don't really like that phrase because unpaid carers save the NHS £15.9 billion a year, and yet they're often overlooked, and it's often not seen as important for people, again, particularly women, when we're talking about child poverty, etc. It's a huge issue, and I think you're right in terms of having to change the discourse about how we present to governments and to councils and to decision makers around how we find more of a balance in society for all people who are disadvantaged or where there's inequality. So yeah, that's my thoughts.
Do you want to take the question next to you as well?
You kind of touched on a lot of the points I was going to ask about in terms of whether or not we should redefine economic inactivity or have a better definition and the wider determinants on health. And if you'd like to see moving into this election, policymakers and politicians talk more about housing, social care, all the wider determinants of health and maybe some better sort of cross portfolio working in our parliament and government as well. Thank you. Sorry.
As we see there, people aren't making those links. So we see there, healthcare and NHS is such like a high issue for people. Social care is down at around 10%. I think that kind of cross working or linking issues to other issues is probably something that sort of needs to be done. They're obviously kind of put up here in silos, so people have to select them, but these things don't actually operate in silos. So I think it is for people to grasp the nettle and say, well, okay, if you want to sort out the NHS and actually social care is a really important thing you need to sort out over here, or if we're sorting out housing, here's the long-term effects. We see from another stats, people are quite open to that idea. So maybe there's an opportunity to take advantage of that.
Just on the economic inactivity point, I'm very sympathetic to the point you're making on the value judgment that places on people like unpaid carers. And I think it is important to, segment people who are not employed or unemployed, which is what economic inactivity actually is defined as, into, various groups for policymakers. So we need to understand those who are not working because they're ill or disabled and would like to, or those who are not able to. And we need to understand when people are being unpaid carers and what support they then need from policymakers to ensure that, they are continuing to be able to deliver that care, because as you say, they save the state a huge amount of money. So I think it's important to really understand the different groups that are within that category. I will say it's an international definition, not to be too much of a statue about it, but it is an international definition defined by the International Labour Organization, so that's why it's used. But I agree that the term feels like it's a value judgment on the people in that category, which includes others, like retired people who are very active in the community and may do lots of volunteering, for example, and students as well, full-time students too. So I think it's really important not to lump everyone together and to think about the individuals within that category.
Yeah, I think a couple of reflections. I think you're just sort of helping us to see again that language really matters, doesn't it? And it's powerful and it's emotive. And we see our politicians use language in certain ways to kind of drive agendas. The hardworking families is often a phrase that we hear plugged time and time again, and who's in and who's out. And I suppose if you're an unpaid carer, you massively might not see yourself aligned in that group that our politicians are saying, well, this is who we're definitely going to go and help. I think it's going to be interesting to watch some of these issues over the kind of coming quarters with the tracker. And I guess I'm thinking particularly about what's going to happen in Westminster with the proposed welfare reform. First and foremost, that's going to have a really direct negative impact on disabled people and people with ill health, but also their carers as well. There's been some really good economic analysis from organisations like Joseph Rowntree Foundation, who are able to point to the income loss of not just disabled people, but people in their household who might work alongside them as carers. And that could have a really dramatic impact, first and foremost, not just on the harm that it might kind of cause those individuals, but then the sort of wider societal issues. If people are unwell, if families can't make that decision to move away from employment and to support people. So I think it's going to be something that we need to kind of watch really carefully, depending on what may or may happen in June.
Just getting the final slide up that Scott gave you a preview of earlier. Eventually, I didn't realise we'd gone back so far. There we go. Fantastic. I'm really sorry to the people with their hands up, but we just haven't got time, because my promise to all of you is to get you out on time each time you come to these, because I know people are rushing to 10 o'clock meetings. I think for me, there's so much in that discussion. Particularly the point on language. The term economically inactive really annoys me, because it just refers to whether or not someone's in working. Most people that go out and spend in a shop, I would consider that an economic activity. And therefore you're dissing anyone in that way, I think. The bit of the debate I see coming is particularly from the business lobby. So there was a tweet I picked up this morning. I don't know if it's from today or not, maybe earlier on. And it was Federation of Small Businesses saying the cost to small businesses of sick pay. And I thought that's a really interesting language term to use, to think about. Actually, we know employers that have support systems available, like holiday pay and like sick pay, generally have a fitter, healthier workforce than those working in a different form of more precarious work. And we do need to think about that. We also need to think about the fact that 40% of people on universal credit in Scotland are in work. And we don't talk about that. We've got a state where you could, if you wanted to phrase it like this, consider that the government is subsidising a low-wage economy. And we don't talk about it in that sense. And I think we need a much more honest conversation about the costs of paying low wages and precarious work to society, because at some point, somewhere, someone has to pick up that cost. So thank you for the whistle-stop tour today. As always, we end up with lots more questions than answers, but hopefully we've given you lots of food for thought and a different perhaps perspective of what you might see from just the headlines in the newspapers. You've got some new data to take away to whatever roles or boards you're on, and perhaps you can use that data in your own roles. So thank you very much to all our panel, and to you, the audience, and always, and to anyone watching this online. Really appreciate it, and we'll see you again in August. Thank you very much.